Hello, my name is Yesenia. My research question is, how are human rights being affected in Ukraine, and what are ways that can help solve human rights issues? Human rights are being violated in Ukraine, but there are some actors such as NGOs, TANs, Actions, and international organizations that can help enforce human rights. So for human rights, these three types are being violated. And these first generation individual rights emphasize political and civil rights, as Scott mentioned on page 376. And then the so-called second generation human rights included the rights to shelter, employment, education, and healthcare, as Scott mentioned, page 377. And third generation human rights group rights sought to protect unpopular or minority groups from the oppression of the majority in society, as Scott mentioned on page 378. So how are human rights being violated? Some examples include Russian forces have committed war crimes against Ukraine. Many Ukrainians have been injured, killed, and displaced. And the Amnesty mentioned how attacks on energy infrastructure has happened, which also causes a lot of damage. Also, the Amnesty International mentioned how there was a lot of evidence of executions of Ukrainian prisoners, and it was also mentioned that Russia did not give access to the UN monitors to where the Ukrainian civilians were being held at. Restrictions on freedom and torture are also ways of how their human rights are being violated. So in this picture, published by the Statista Research Department, it shows how many casualties have happened since the start of the Russian-Ukraine war. This shows how human rights have been violated and the amount of people that have suffered, and more to come since this was posted. So NGOs and TANs. So most asylum NGOs in Ukraine sought to spread their norms and help their clients via personalized relationships with state officials, as Moselberg mentioned in page 135 of their article. And in the Ukraine case discussed here, Ukrainian activists have asked major international NGOs to support the country in appealing to the U.S. State Department, the U.S. Department of Defense, and Ukraine's other NATO allies to put pressure on Zelensky and his generals regarding the importance of complying with the ICCPR, the Refugee Convention, and norms of gender equality, and openly praise him if he shifts gears accordingly, as Carpenter mentioned on page 364 of their article. So it shows how NGOs are very important when it comes to helping for human rights. And then as for TANs, they seek to create or change norms of or unwritten standards of acceptable and unacceptable behavior, which help reduce the consequence of anarchy in the international system that realists tend to emphasize, as Scott mentioned in page 448. Then on the left side, I have a picture of the international organizations that are in the book by Scott in page 402, and some of these have helped, such as the Human Rights Watch. And then the sanctions include freezing assets and banning loans from Russian banks, as Scott mentioned, page 314. And I think sanctions are also important because they're helping freeze the assets for Russia, and Russia needs money to do a war. And these are my references. Thank you.